Good afternoon. For those who I don't know, I'm Jonathan Sherbino. I'm the director for Merit, and welcome to the Sibley Lecture. If you're not sure what Merit is, it's a community of faculty and of learners and of scientists that are engaged in education scholarship. If you want to learn a bit more about it, you can discover us at merit.mcmaster.ca. If you think the Sibley Lecture is amazing, let me just profile a couple of other events that are coming to put into your calendar. On May 13th, we have an all-day mixed methods workshop. And if you're saying, I struggle with some of the complex questions and innovations that I'm doing, I wonder if there is a way for me to understand how to think about these problems, or perhaps you're reading some in the literature around mixed methods, you want a more in-depth understanding, we'd invite you to come to that workshop. All the registration detail is at our website. And then, of course, on June 10th is our annual Nerd Day, which is a very appropriate title for Norman Education Research Day. This is an opportunity to also register, details at our website, but come and see who is doing innovation and what are the studies that are changing how we select, teach, assess, remediate, deal with issues of professionalism, deal with issues of community, all the questions that are confronting us as health profession educators. If nothing else, come and discover a network of people that are part of the McMaster community that are advancing our understanding of the science and the innovation in our education programs. But let's turn our attention to the Sibley Lecture this evening. The Sibley Lecture is provided through an award from the Sibley family, recognizing John C. Sibley, who was the Associate Dean for Education and in 1979 took on this role. Jack Sibley was well known for this idea of interdisciplinary approach, particularly to the delivery of health in the community. And so with this, we're able to fund our invited speaker. And you're going to hear further at the end of our presentation, the Sibley Award winners for part-time faculty who are changing and making a difference in the delivery of education in our communities. We'll have a little bit more to hear about that then. I'll also tell you that we'll have a chance to connect again afterwards. We're going to bring out even more food so you can have a reason to stay a little bit late if you're feeling a bit hungry, and to meet and reconnect with some of your colleagues and make new connections with others who are engaged in this whole conversation about how can we make education and learning, how can we advance it as a community. It's my great honor, and I'm really excited to have met in person and connected with Dr. Lomis. Dr. Lomis is the Vice President for Medical Education Innovations at the American Medical Association, where she's leading a group that's responsible for the AMA Change Med Ed initiative. You're going to hear a lot more about that over the course of her presentation. Dr. Lomis's portfolio is looking at the idea of precision education. How can we look to the individual? What are the metrics and what are the system requirements in order to offer a much more unique, tailored, and precise type of learning experience through the whole continuum of undergraduate to postgraduate to continuing education and practice. In addition, Dr. Lomis serves as an expert advising the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And previously, she was a professor of surgery and the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Medical Education at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Lomis.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank all of you for the work that you do every day to improve education. The best part of my job is exactly this sort of thing where I get to go to so many sites. We do our work through people like you. We don't directly deliver the education, right? So we rely on people who are innovative and creative and really devoted to education across the continuum. So thank you for having me, and thanks for the work that you do. This is a relatively small group, and I do not mind interruption. And so I really encourage you, I'd love this to be more of a discussion. I have a presentation, but if you have a question or a thought or a disagreement, just feel free to interject along the way. We don't have to wait until the end for questions. So just the disclosures is that I like to acknowledge, as I have already, that a lot of what you're going to hear is not necessarily just my own personal work, but it really is drawn from colleagues like all of you across the United States, as well as international interactions that we have. And then we always point out that this may not necessarily reflect AMA policy in some of the things we're presenting, but for the most part, this is very aligned with what the AMA wants to do, which is kind of personalize education. And it was interesting. I got some feedback recently around this concept of precision education. That some people, it's landing as very technical and sterile and cold. And indeed, it's meant to be the complete polar opposite. And so I'm glad I got that feedback because you described it well. It's really trying to meet every individual where they are and serve them personally. And so we are going to do that through rather technical means, but really trying to think through what the individual needs. So today I will talk about what we mean by precision education and precision education systems and share some examples of concrete projects that we are funding right now. I'm going to talk about this concept of socio-technical systems theory, which is a really interesting way to think about and applying these new technologies. And then because some of you are dedicated researchers, I will highlight some of the theoretical underpinnings of what we're doing, as well as a lot of the questions that we have. And then I recognize that some of you are more the frontline faculty out there trying to do the good work of teaching on a day-to-day basis. So having that conversation together between what individuals are seeing learners struggle with and what researchers are trying to think about is a really wonderful mix tonight that we can take advantage of. So in the US, we talk a lot about trying to improve the quality of our health system. I'm sure many of you are aware of the concept of a quintuple aim for healthcare. And as we at the AMA started to think about the implications of AI, I also started to translate that to the same outcomes for health professions education across the board. And so there is opportunity to enhance the learner's experience, just as we would enhance a patient's experience, to reduce the cost of education, just as we'd like to reduce the cost of care, et cetera. And so we really feel like these new and emerging tools that allow us to address all 5 of these aims and to really think about our work in medical education, health professions education broadly, as that continual quality improvement process and better aligning with the learner's actual experience throughout their career. Has anyone seen the Master Adaptive Learner Framework previously? A couple people might be familiar with it. So this is a concept that arose from the very first grant cycle that we did. It ran from 2013 to 2018. And so that was a consortium of medical schools trying to modernize how we think about education. And this group was recognizing then, and now of course it's even more pertinent, that it's impossible to, quote, cover everything. This notion of educational programs as delivering content is not realistic to the rapidly expanding amount of content that there is. And so the group was talking about how do we teach individuals to continue to learn throughout their career? And that sounds sort of strange because we have all said we want to be lifelong learners, and anybody who gets into medical school is certainly an accomplished student, right? But they're accomplished in, here's what I want you to learn, regurgitate it back to me. And they aren't necessarily as capable of that informed self-assessment of what should I learn and then how do I get that done during a busy day, which is what we have to do throughout our careers. And so what you'll see if you read this model, it is really like a PDSA cycle for the individual. It's thinking about how to constantly improve. And so as you go throughout your day, recognizing if there's a gap, deciding about, of my many gaps, which one am I going to prioritize to pursue? Because I can't keep track of everything. How will I find resources that'll be useful? And then how do I know if I've really improved? And so that's the cycle that is meant to be iterative and repeated over time. And then you'll see there's some batteries down there at the bottom that charge this whole process. And so the belief was that really, how do you create that growth mindset? Rekindle the curiosity that all of us start with as we're young folks entering into health professions or into research pathways. But to be honest, sometimes traditional education beats it out of us, right? When we get distracted by incentives that aren't aligned with supporting that curiosity. So mindset and motivation are important. And then you'll see we have there a rheostat of coaching. And we believe strongly that in the new future, rather than delivering content so much, the value of the faculty will be to provide more direct observation, assessment, and then coaching to the individual so that they can continually go through repeated cycles of this. So as I said, we had developed this model, but now we're thinking about how to merge it with this model out of informatics. And so the notion that there's a lot of data out there, but it's not always meaningful to us, and it has to go through several cycles of work in order to go from the raw data to actual knowledge and wisdom. So thinking about putting those two models together, what you end up with is basically a supercharged master adaptive learner cycle. And so you'll see that the names of some of these elements of the cycle are exactly from the master adaptive learner model. All we're doing here is portraying the fact that if you infuse that process with data throughout, and you also pull data out of the process itself, then you're going to supercharge this. And so I like to describe precision education as competency-based medical education that's informed by data and analytics and emerging technologies to really help us attain something that has been somewhat out of reach for us, despite our best efforts in terms of really reaching the ideal of competency-based education and individualized learning pathways. The other thing you can see here is that we envision that model can function at multiple levels. So we've talked about the individual learner. You could also think about this for a cohort of learners, perhaps in graduate medical education, if you're running a program, or you can think about it at the level of the institution. And at that point, it starts to merge to the concept of the learning health system, right? So the learning health system described by the US National Academy of Medicine years ago talked about a health system looking at its performance data to try to improve. The fault of that model is that they've never really brought it down to the level of the individuals who have to learn within that system for the system to grow. And so we're now working with them to merge their big picture of the learning health system with master adaptive learner at the level of individuals within that system. So as I said, this is our goal, and really heavily relying on the opportunity to capture more data in different ways in order to drive this cycle. So we recently had a short perspective piece published in the New England Journal of Medicine trying to explain why we think this is helpful across one's career. And I'm sure that the US system has its faults. I don't think it's too different from some of the challenge that you all have in your system as well. But as we move through phases of training, there's not a fluid connection. And so a typical pathway is irregular. Every time someone moves, for instance, from medical school to residency, there's not a great transition there. There's loss of data. There's loss of information about the person's growth. They sort of have to start over and reestablish. And then the same thing, if you progress out into practice, then you have even less support as you go through. The other thing that happens in our system is that because we have the same process for everyone, the outcomes of the learning is what's variable. And that's the opposite of what we want, right? We ideally would have all learners attain the same competency. And so this is represented as one curve, but in reality, we all know that you would see lots of different kinds of curves and trajectories, with some people performing well early and then struggling when they're in the clinical environment, and vice versa. And so our vision for precision education is that with a little more attention to that continuity, supporting that with data and informatics, and really being able to respond to individual competency strengths and weaknesses, then we can smooth out the trajectory and enhance the overall competency of each individual. And this really comes from a recognition. I think historically, at least in the US, we have overemphasized medical knowledge as the primary domain that gets you in the door and gets you through your progression. Now, it's easier to assess, but we all know that practice relies upon wonderful communication skills and teamwork and professionalism. And those things, even though we say verbally that we care about them, if you look at our assessment systems, they are the expression of our values to the learners. And often those domains are lesser assessed. And so that's why we worry that in certain careers and trajectories, given an individual, they struggle in certain settings because of the types of competencies they're being called upon. So we can know that better and respond to that, we can smooth out their journey. So to promote this, the American Medical Association has really invested a great deal into medical education innovation over the last decade, over $40 million. We're looking first at medical school education and then graduate medical education. And now we have this new portfolio of thinking about precision education across the continuum. So we wanted to engage medical school residency and practicing physicians to explore this concept and see if we can actually bring it to life, because it's certainly easier said than done, right? The description of what I'm talking about here. So this is a $12 million grant project over the next 4 years. And we have 3 goals that we wanted to talk about. One was we think there are ways to use new technologies to catalyze assessments to capture things that we haven't been able to capture before. And so we all know our faculty are quite busy. The opportunity to give direct observation and feedback is limited. Can we complement the work with faculty, not replace, by using some of these emerging technologies? And we specifically wanted to do that beyond the domain of medical knowledge for the point that I made earlier. So we told everybody, don't come to us with a project that's about getting ready for the licensing exam. That's not what we're interested in. Important, but not what we're going to do here. And then this is the important part, what I call the so what. It doesn't help to gather a bunch of data about a learner unless you're going to change what you do for that learner. And so the projects are expected to have a response. What is the process that you're going to act upon the data and individualize the learner's experience? And then, as I said, it was our ambition to touch all points of the continuum. So this is a pretty challenging mix of things to ask of any group. And so we spent a lot of time preparing the grants. So before the applications were even open, we had multiple information sessions, but we also did a very deliberate outreach to the kinds of institutions that normally would not see themselves in our programs. When we look back at our prior grant programs, by default, we tend to attract grantees from the high-powered academic, highly resourced centers. Those are the people who have the bandwidth. They have support teams that can help them write the amazing grants. We were talking about grant writing earlier. And we fear that if we're not intentional about who we bring on board, then we'll only worsen a digital divide, right? If we dive into this, then the haves will have more and the have-nots will fall even farther behind. And so we called and reached out to organizations that were different types of institutions and settings. So this is what we ended up with, and I won't go into each one in detail, but you can see from the visual that we were successful in capturing our 3 different goals across these 11 projects and covering the continuum. The arrows indicate if a project is starting at one level and then has the desire to expand into another level of training over the 4-year work plan. This is what's fascinating. In the 11 projects, you see we have over 80 different institutions involved. So these are multi-institutional collaboratives that have come to the table together. And it includes some of our heavy hitters. Our accreditors and certifying bodies are parts of some of these grants. To us, that just reflects that we're on the right track, that this is of interest across the continuum to everyone, and they want to help us unpack how to do this and how to do it well. The QR code is here if you're curious to read about each grant in detail. There's a PDF file that has a little one-pager, their pitch, so to speak, and some description of their projects. I'll give you a little overview in this next slide here. So this is the same group resorted by the predominant technology technique. Again, these are $1 million grants over a 4-year period. So that's a gross simplification. They're all using multiple angles on this. But this is one way to share with you the highlights of the projects. There's a whole swath that are looking at how do we capture all the data that's out there and put it together in a meaningful way. And so we're in a data-rich environment, but we can't act upon it because it's siloed. We can't connect the dots. And so we're doing these kinds of synthesis and then benchmarking for individuals to see how they perform against an aggregate cohort at multiple levels. One is a brand new DO school in a rural setting for an underserved population. Another is looking specifically at the UME to GME transition with a conglomeration of medical schools looking at the residency performance of their graduates and using that to inform improvements locally. This one is really interesting in terms of trying to get a different different kind of organization on board. So this is the state of Georgia. If you're not familiar in the United States, among the 50 states, Georgia is among the lowest if it were for overall health outcomes. They struggle as a state, despite really great institutions within the state. So this is a collaboration of all the family practice residency programs across the state of Georgia, trying to gather data to link the training of each resident to the local community health outcomes, integrating data in that way. These two studies are looking at specialty-specific performance. So the one based at Michigan is around anesthesiology, so looking at anesthesia residency performance across the country. And then the Wisconsin-based project is another conglomerate that's looking at graduates of vascular surgery training programs, looking at their early practice performance and using that to go back and inform programs about how they could improve their own training processes. I talked to some folks today who are playing with simulation. We have only a couple simulation because we felt like a lot of people are engaging in that. But this one is really interesting. The LSU one is looking at providing just-in-time support to practice communication tools. So when they talked to their residents, the thing that stressed the residents out the most about being on call by themselves at night, particularly early in their training, was difficult conversations. And they didn't have anybody there to kind of run things by. So they are building an on-demand virtual performance, a virtual simulation platform where the resident can just verbally say, here's the general situation I'm facing. And they can go through a little exercise with a virtual patient to stumble through their words before they go to talk to the patient and the family in the middle of the night. And so we're excited this is going to meet them where they really perceive a need. A much more technical project is building upon work that Carla Pugh's been doing at Stanford for quite some time. This is a surgical forward, but not only limited to surgery, but this is using a lot of different sensor data, including pressure sensor, to give feedback to proceduralists, whether they're surgeons or other proceduralists. So it's a dimension. As a surgeon, this is one of the things that was always hardest for me. You allow a trainee to do as much as you think is safe until a point where they might cause an injury that you can't fix, and that's when you have to step in. Pressure on tissues is the one thing that's really hard to perceive. And so I often would find myself having to take the case as I couldn't tell if they were tugging too hard or not enough. And so she's gathering actual haptic data through the instruments so that we can see that in real time and know. We have several that are capitalizing on ambient AI. I'm sure you all are using ambient AI scribing systems increasingly in your clinical settings. Historically, we would evaluate a learner's clinical reasoning by their written note. And people are worried now that, okay, we have ambient scribe, they won't write notes, they won't learn how to reason. But we actually have the encounter, we have the entire conversation. So rather than have a proxy of a note that they've written later, we can actually look into the encounter and see, does it seem to be a hypothesis-driven conversation that's happening here? Did they go back and ask for, elaborating data on some things? And there's projects that are also using it to evaluate communication skills. And even though so much of communication is nonverbal, and these will be just verbal at this stage, there's this whole concept that I was not familiar with before of paralinguistics. How often do they interrupt the patient? Where were their cues for empathy that they kind of just ran right through? So apparently there's a lot more that you can, beside just the words, give some feedback on, and we're exploring that. And then this is one sorted by itself because it's quite unique. This is the University of Hawaii, and they have an equation, a math equation for values. It was a really fascinating proposal to read, and we actually had to call them and have them explain it to us, to be honest. But they're trying to improve rural practice and coverage in Hawaii, as we are in all of our states. But they have, of course, a very unique indigenous population that they're trying to solve and a very special culture. And so they are doing a study of gathering what are those cultural values of the communities and of particularly successful practicing physicians in those communities. And then using the analytics, the predictive analytics, to identify students who may possess those values early so that you can put them into a special track and really foster and kindle those values. And we were a bit concerned, is it too specific? to Hawaii? And if you're not somewhere where you can go out surfing, is that going to make a difference? But when we really dug into it, a lot of those values are very consistent across any rural setting. The notion of connection to the land and a sense of community that's very strong. So that's a quick overview, really fascinating ideas that are coming to bear. As we think about the potential for AI in health professions education, I know many of you are thinking about this. There's so many opportunities arising. This is a scoping review that's probably already out of date. It's a couple years old now, but if you haven't thought through these, this is a great starting paper to think about the ways in which we could use AI. And I say AI, but we tend to use that term. We were talking about this earlier as a magic wand singular entity. And with obviously under the hood, there are many different technologies and capabilities. And we need to start as educators to be more specific with our language around that. And so thinking through these opportunities is important to all of us. I'm excited because I believe AI will move us into a world where working and learning are more tightly integrated. And even though we do all espouse to be continuing lifelong learners, and certainly we look something up in the moment very frequently, we still think about learning as dedicated time. I set a couple of hours aside to try to read journals, but I never get to it because my medical records are behind and I'm still trying to have a life and get to my kids' ball game. And I think this is going to become more and more seamless. So as we engage in tools that are helping us deliver care, they will be teaching us. And so it's our opportunity right now to shape those tools to be educationally valuable as well. So the AMA likes to promote this concept of augmented intelligence, partially to reassure our doctors that we don't think that they're going to be replaced anytime soon. But really this notion of ideally what we want is these tools to augment what we can also do. And we have a lot to learn about that appropriate mix. This theorem from informatics predates our attention to AI. This was published in 2009 by Chuck Friedman. But in that notion of a physician or other health professional who successfully taps into the knowledge of then the cloud, now we would include AI tools, should perform better than that person acting alone from what's in their head. But historically, we've really treasured what's in your head as an individual, and we've kind of ignored this interaction part. And I said should because some of you have probably seen some studies where indeed AI acting alone has outperformed a physician trying to use AI in certain diagnostic tasks. We do not believe that's because the AI is necessarily, quote, better. We believe it's because the physicians haven't been trained how to use AI effectively. And so we're promoting that kind of education. And many of you are familiar with diagnostic reasoning theories and how we have these different systems, right? We have the quick recognition pattern-based system versus the deeper, slow down, have to think things through, and we can toggle back and forth between those. What we haven't thought, though, with that model is the effect of the group. And I do have some smatterings of AI-generated images. If you want to chat about those later, they can be very entertaining. This is if you ask for a diverse group of people doing team-based care in 2030, and it's pretty funny. But we as educators, we still assess at the individual level almost exclusively, but the day-to-day work doesn't work that way. None of us make decisions entirely in isolation, and either benefiting from our team members or data resources or both. And so is there a new world in which we rethink this system and think about how does AI actually fit into it? Can AI help us more quickly recognize patterns and move into safely a pattern process that's more efficient? But importantly, can AI give us the flag of saying, hey, you're charging down a pathway and maybe you should slow down and consider an alternative? And so recognizing, at least in the US, that we have around 800,000 significant harms per year from diagnostic error alone, it's important that we think about how to use these tools to make ourselves better. But as educators, we worry a lot about the concept of de-skilling. If we start to allow learners to use these tools, will they be able to do the job? Will they be able to oversee these tools? And there is emerging evidence that as physicians are using AI tools in various capacities, that they do show evidence of de-skilling. Not to deny that in any way. I think our challenge for ourselves is, if we're worried about de-skilling, the first question is it still a skill that we need? If we go back to the writing of the note, people are very worried that people won't know how to write a note. The future electronic record will generate its own note and synthesis. We're already getting this out of these systems where it can tell you this is essentially what's happened since the last time you saw this patient. And so thinking through and really asking ourselves, is that current note still a proxy for clinical reasoning when it is auto-generated and cut and paste, and it's a conglomeration and it's bloated? It doesn't really focus on what the individual is really thinking. So challenging our assumptions first is the first step. And then if it is, yes, we still do need to have that skill in some way, are there different ways to go about teaching to it? And so I like to think of the concept rather as differently skilling than thinking through how, but as a researcher, what is that right mix? How much of that foundational knowledge do you need before you engage with the tools in order to do that effectively and to fulfill your responsibility for oversight of what the tool gives you back? And so we don't know that yet. We certainly can't stop teaching content. That's not my point at all. But we can't continue to try to just jam in content either. We're going to have to find what's that sweet spot of knowing enough to use these tools carefully. So this brings us to socio-technical systems theory, which again sounds cold and abstract. But really what it does is recognize that technology alone cannot affect any of the changes that we've been describing, that we need to attend to the situation and the context in which we are using these tools. And so if we're gathering a lot of data about a learner, but we're doing that in a traditional context that's very pressure cooker around performance and looking like a high performer, that data now becomes threatening. I now feel like I'm in a surveillance state, right? And so thinking about all the other things that have to change in addition to developing these tools and the AI. And so I like this theory. Many of you may recognize the foundation of, we talk about system as people, processes, and technology. So that's represented here. But it emphasizes some of these other elements. And so essentially, if we think about what's happening right now, the people have incentives to pursue certain work processes, and there's an infrastructure to support them as they go through this cycle. Well, right now, the roles are changing, right? We really have a threat to our professional identity as we bring in these knowledge tools if our identity has been anchored primarily in our ability to have this great expertise and knowledge. We have to change our incentives, at least in the US. The incentive for the learner currently is to hide any deficits and hide any doubts. And that's true in most cultures, not just healthcare. But if it's so hard to advance from one step to another, you smile and nod and try to look good and then figure it out later, totally missing the opportunity to engage with an interested and invested faculty member who could really help you grow. And so thinking about our workflows and practices, right now those faculty members are under great strain for high throughput, seeing many, many patients, very little time and space dedicated to taking time with the learner. That has to change. The technology we're building out, but it will require new infrastructure, not only the computing power, et cetera, but we should be thinking about the environmental impacts of these tools as a form of infrastructure and be critical in thinking about how we use that. And then finally, you have to be in a culture where this is really a supportive and developmental orientation so that isn't perceived as that threat. And so, as I said, I like this model because in addition to the traditional view of the system, it elevates these human things, the emotions under the current, our doubts and our pressures on our behaviors that we really need to uncover as we build these processes. So we talked about the shifting roles, and so the health professional is moving from the steward of knowledge, that term that we often use. And the future most successful professionals will not be the one who has all the answers, but the one who asks the best questions and can think critically about what's put in front of them as a potential answer and really brings that in as a professional duty that's new to us. And then similarly for us as educators, we need to move away from thinking about the curriculum and delivering content and redeploy our resources towards direct observation, feedback, supporting the learners in this process, providing coaching, curating, etc. And so thinking about ways where we duplicate at every medical school the delivery of content, which now the learners get in so many different ways anyway. Redeploying and redesigning our programs will help. And then we believe this will actually contribute to well-being. This is the human part for us. And that's why we feel like even though this is data and tech, it should be humanizing and warm. We know from our work in clinical practices, these are the drivers of burnout or lack of burnout in our practicing physicians in the US. And many of our learners say they have, a less of a support, less of a sense of purpose because they're chasing these alter incentives and not really focusing on the patient. And so you can generate more meaning in work, we could be more efficient, et cetera. All of these things should make for greater well-being if we do this well. And that's the if. I'm going to transition a little bit to talking about where this could go awry. This is a resource that if any of you are coming to the workshop tomorrow, we'll dive into in a little more detail. I created this because when we did a mini grant in precision education a couple of years ago just to test the waters and see where people were with things before we did the big initiative. And out of over 100 letters of intent, no one raised any potential concerns ethically about the data collection, the limitations of the technology, et cetera. I was very dismayed. Now, I get it. You're trying to convince a funder to give you money. And so maybe you don't want to air your dirty laundry, but to me, it was the lack of responsibility, most likely a lack of real awareness of what this takes. Because you've got educators who have wonderful intentions and they don't know the technology. So we created this draft. It's very basic guide, but it's a wonderful introduction. And we asked people to look at it before they submitted their full application as a way to go through that. And so, as I said, we won't dig into this too much now. Happy to elaborate on it in the Q&A if you prefer. Well, what we are doing now with the grantees that we did select is that we've dug in early on into the challenges. So one of the fields in their grant application for the finalists was to have a paragraph about what you were worried about, what might go wrong. And we had to really convince them to fill that out with honesty. We really wanted to hear from them. And again, making sure they weren't too caught up in us being the funder and said, honestly, if you have a superficial answer here, you will not get funded. We want to see what's going to be hard. And so we've been able to take all of that input and we used AI to help us do a thematic analysis, and it fell into these big buckets. And so a lot of concerns at the center first around getting the data, accessing, integrating data, all the technical aspects were loud and clear, which we would expect. Then a lot of thought around engagement. How do we get the learners to trust this? How do we get the faculty to buy in and be part of this? And so thinking about engagement from both of those groups. What is the organizational culture that has to change to make this actually come to fruition the way we envision it? And then ultimately, all this feeds into being very responsible about the design and development. And really the word we're using here is humility. We're excited. We're going to build cool things, but don't overclaim early on. Let's really critically think about whether these things are working as intended and how will we build a process that we can monitor and flag if it's not. So getting into these in just a little bit more detail, as I mentioned, interoperability, getting access to the data, those are big first steps. And then, of course, thinking about privacy and does the data have the right fields and annotation and labels so that you can make heads or tails out of it. And Teresa, you're an expert in the analytics and data, so you know all about that. Another big concern is which AI model to use because they're evolving so quickly. And so we have an expert who's helping people think about an AI agnostic design that you could plug and play different tools as they grow and improve. Responsible design and development, I mentioned, I flagged the word humility. This is a diagram from the same group that helped to articulate that notion of the socio-technical systems theory. We don't have to go through it in detail. I've got references throughout here for our researchers in particular, because I know they want to see some of the frameworks and the underlying conceptual theories. But really thinking about how do we monitor for mistakes. These will not all work perfectly to begin with. So what structures are we putting in place right from the beginning to protect people? And then, as you heard, we were intentional to try to do this in settings that were unexpected, to see what it really takes for the average program to try to do this. How do we think about engagement? We had one of your Canadians, Laura Varpio, come and talk about, I don't know if everyone's seen her recent paper on engagement, but I like it because it's a more fluid thinking about, it's not a fixed state. There's multiple dimensions that impact agency. She had looked at this more as a retrospective description of what influences agency. And so we flipped it and told our grantees, build this in from the beginning. Think about these elements and design against them right from the start. And then the organizational culture issue, Martin Pusick and other colleagues have introduced me to the deliberately developmental organization model. We can elaborate on that more again if you'd like in the Q&A. But essentially, it is recognizing that an organization will do better if you are in an environment where indeed you can disclose when you don't know something, and it's seen as a healthy process that we really need so that we can all improve. And I love this notion that destabilization is necessary for high quality. And then as researchers, how can we use AI tools to affect our own work? And so this is an image from basic science research, and there are some interesting groups thinking about using multi-agentic approaches to expand the size of your lab group and generate more brainstorming ideas and potentially divvy up tasks and merge them back together, all still with the person in the human in the loop, of course, which is a term I'll come back to because I'm not a great fan of it. But they really like the notion that these tools help them challenge their assumptions about how to approach a given problem and maybe offer different ways of thinking about it. And then to come back to this notion that all this data and technology is valuable, but there's also still precision when we get to know our learners well, right? And so having that relationship, whether it's short-term encounter with a learner, but trying to dial into where they are and creating a space where they can grow, even if you're only with them for a half-day clinic, or if it's a more longitudinal coaching relationship, that human part is what's rewarding to us as educators. And that's what our learners really look to us for, as opposed to delivering that content. That's what they really want. So that's all I had for formal remarks, because I did want to leave opportunity for us to have some Q&A. So.
Question. Okay. I didn't see. I was wondering, as you were presenting some of that information there, issues regarding ownership of data, given that there are currently a handful of, whatever, I'm not sure what the right term is, but like bigger AI systems, out of which most of all other AI software programs kind of depend upon. And so thinking of ownership of data from the perspective of, there's, I think, real questions that haven't been answered at a big level in terms of use of the data that exists or is all the time being collected, whether it's to weaponize, politicize, monetize. So I was just wondering if the AMA has some policy or intention in terms of figuring out ownership of the data. And the second part to that was accountability. So for users, whether it's the educators or the learners, or clinicians for that matter, using those programs, those AI models or software, where is the line of accountability if it's the data or if that model fails, and if someone, whether it's at a large scale and concepts are being learned in the wrong way, or values start being kind of generalized or taken up that maybe were unintentional and kind of just embedded somewhere in the software there, or whether there's specific decisions that end up in medical error, treatment errors, diagnostic errors. So that's sort of from the accountability side. So I was wondering if those two things, ownership and accountability.
Yeah, those are great questions. And actually, yes.
Just ask you to summarize the
For,
question.
for the, okay. Two major points in the question. The first is thinking about data ownership and protection of data and appropriate use of data. And then the other is the accountability as we use these tools for the impacts that they have. A big overview. So to the first point, it's a really important question. I was at an event at the National Academy of Medicine earlier this week, and they had multiple patient advocates at the table as we were discussing, and this was mostly around the clinical use of AI, not so much the educational. And they were interesting. They said, most patients aren't not worried about you using their data, particularly if they have struggled from a problem in which a dearth of data has limited their impact and their care. So for instance, unusual disease or something, they're actually not that averse to having their data used if it's with transparency. What they are averse to is the monetization that you talked about. And so thinking through, that is a very important point to raise. And then you also talked about the fact that data sets are now owned or controlled by certain groups. And we've worked with a colleague at MIT he became known in the AI space for what's called Mimic, in which he created a copy database similar to, but not exactly, the health information of a given population from a health system, and made that safe and publicly available in a non-identifying way so that AI researchers could get into a big data set that they had through the whole Harvard and Brigham system without having actual people's data. So there are AI scientists trying to democratize access so that people can study these tools and develop them. And we're trying to support that. But this was a big conversation with our grantees, is thinking about something like ambient scribe. As you describe it, it sounds like, okay, I'm going to capture the resident and the patient. And so you have to get consent from the patient. But what happens when the nurse comes in the room to offer some assistance or give some information? Do we have their permission to capture their part of the encounter? What about the family members who are there, et cetera? And so as we deploy these things in clinical environments, we do have to think broadly about whose data might be involved in addition to what we think we have in mind. So as you saw, part of what we're trying to do with these projects is to scare them a little bit up front, right? We were really leaning in on these challenges. We built multiple sessions based on what we heard from them as risks, and have had full meetings and consortium gatherings around each of those topics early as they're just starting. These grants launched in January, so that hopefully they have these things in mind as they move forward. To the accountability question, I think, first of all, at the health level, there's a total lack of clarity about if a physician uses a tool and there's something error within that, who is accountable, all the legal repercussions, because there's also the flip side that it won't be long before it would be not standard of care to not use AI. Like, you would not be meeting standard of care if you're just trying to work from within your own head. So it is a very nebulous space right now that makes a lot of clinicians nervous. In our work, what we are really harping on is rapid cycle improvement processes and monitoring, and really engaging all the stakeholders into trying to critique the tool. Many of you have probably heard this idea of red teaming. So playing with a tool with the intent to break it before you deploy it. And you can intend to break it as a malicious actor, which is not typically what we'll encounter. But importantly, you could attempt to break it as a well-intentioned user who's just misusing the tool. So there are different strategies to test some of these things and do smaller pilots, get feedback, iterate, and improve over time to try to address that. But it does bring me back to my side comment about the human in the loop. The term gets tossed around, and I don't think it's useful at all. Because if we think about it, if we are asking an AI tool to help us in some capacity, it means that we can't do the thing by ourselves, ideally, right? If we're actually serving a purpose. And so to say that we're going to catch problems is very superficial. And we also know from automation data from the 70s that humans are really bad at surveillance. We need to be cognitively engaged in a task. We're not good at watching things go by. That's why the TSA agents are thrown false images on their screen every once in a while that actually has a gun to make sure that they're paying attention to what's happening. We're really not good if it's all just monitoring. And so when we talk about human in the loop, we talk about really thinking about collectively, this is a new professional duty that we have to adopt in terms of our ethics, that we have to say we have a role in oversight and contributing to the feedback. We may not be responsible for how the model works, but we should be watching for potential errors and engaging everyone actively in that process. And at first, some people bristle. They're like, how can I possibly oversee a tool like that? I can't create an AI tool. I'm not a computer programmer. But yet, when there's a new drug, as physicians for years, we've felt that we should be capable of reading a drug trial paper and deciding whether to use that drug in our practice. I will say AI papers are a lot harder to read to me, having dipped my toe into that, but it's the same idea that we should be able to build our own skill set in knowing at least what questions to ask and what to watch for in terms of limitations. Thank you. Those are important points. Yes.
Thank you so much. One of the questions I had was if you have any experience with what's worked for promoting uptake of some of things, because my observation has been that people use the tools, but it's often for simplistic things like emails or maybe summarization, but often on the ground, they're not actually using it in a way that's really, promoting some of the more sophisticated things that you mentioned folks are doing research on.
Yeah, so for the folks on Zoom, the question was, how do we promote uptake of some of these tools and help people start to really use them to the optimal benefit? Quick summary. So I think that makes me think about a couple different elements, but one of the things that I'm very worried about, I first published in 2021 around a call to action that we should be thinking about AI in education. So I feel like I've been talking to myself for about 5 years now, but they're finally catching ground, right? Because people are starting to engage in it. It's more real and they can grab onto it and see it. But what I fear now is the analogy if you're thinking about teaching a teenager to drive, right? You can take the teenager to the parking lot with one particular car and show them where the pedals are and turn signals and things and have them do a couple laps and maybe try to park between some cones. They're not ready to drive yet, right? Because they haven't had any of the rules of the road. They don't know the traffic signs and the signals and don't text and drive and all that. So people are diving into the individual car and fiddling with it and playing with it, but they haven't had driver's ed. And so they don't know the fundamental limitations and the things to watch out for in the pitfalls. So we have to, I think a lot of folks are hesitant to teach about AI because it feels like it's moving too fast. There's a layer that is agnostic to the specific tool, understanding the data sets and how this is trained and how that introduces potential risk and error and lack of applicability, et cetera. So you have that foundation, then you couple it with active engagement, preferably with a facilitator of some kind, right? So I don't know if anyone's been part of a promptathon where you actively all try together a particular task using a variety of different tools, often LLMs right now. And then you see how it works, but you've got a knowing person in the mix who can say, so this illustrates the potential risk of lack of representation of the representativeness of the data or the risk of model drift, et cetera. So you have to have an expert that can help layer as you're experimenting so that you're learning those key components to think about. And right now, a lot of faculty feel like they're in no position whatsoever to do that, right? And so if we always talk about this notion of co-production with learners, this is the moment. We've got learners, students and residents. They're using these tools often in secret because we've projected that we're not ready, you shouldn't do it. Some places actually forbid it in various settings, and that's the worst situation to be in because transparent sharing, co-learning together is going to help us get through the fastest. I had another thought related to that, and maybe it'll come back to me of thinking through the applications of that. But I have another question in the meantime. Yes.
What are the medium goals for the AMA
in this precision education initiative?
Yeah, thanks for asking.
Resources, have been delegated. Funding has been put forward. Partnerships have been established. What does it look like in terms of success?
So the question is, what are we hoping to get out of this particular initiative? So this is 4-year period, 11 projects, $12 million, sizable investment. We're excited that we have 80 organizations. By no stretch of the imagination will we have done precision education, right? We're trying to do this in lots of different places and across the continuum. What we're trying really to do is uncover the pitfalls and think about what will it take for more and more organizations to be able to do this and do it well. And so that's why we are so focused on challenges and struggles. And so we have a good history among our grantees of creating a trusting community of practice. And really, we amplify the fact that for true innovation, you will have failure. These are high stakes environments, so we don't like to think about that. But if we identify trouble early and reposition, redesign, and iterate, that's responsible design and development. And so what we're really hoping to do is understand where it's hard and point it in the right direction so that we're doing it well. Because if we do this poorly out of the gates and learners feel this as a threat and a state of surveillance, and if someone's constantly looking over my shoulder, then the whole concept is sabotaged from the beginning. And that reminds me of what I wanted to say in response to your question earlier too. The other point is thinking about the engagement and the buy-in piece of things. We had a panel at our consortium gathering of learners, and learners broadly. We had a practicing physician because we are doing this across the entire continuum. We gave them an hour time slot and we let them generate their own session and the content, and they ran their own panel and moderated it. So again, trying to role model that notion of co-production and letting them have agency. And so they chose to speak to us about what it would take for them to trust these systems. And it was really quite valuable. There's things that you would automatically assume, such as being transparent about how it's being used, being careful about my data, et cetera. But there were some real simple pearls in there. Start small, simple pilots, engage us so that we can see how that's working. And this one was really interesting. Start with the faculty that we like and trust. The ones who, when we get their feedback, we take it seriously. Early in my career as a surgeon, I did some work in trying to improve communication skills and feedback from faculty to the residents. And the residents are like, I really don't want many of these faculty members to give me feedback about my communication skills, right? So trying to be authentic to who do they value and trust, starting in those smaller settings first, so that together you're testing the whole concept and then thinking about amplifying it out. But that was just, again, an example that we have to engage with all the stakeholders to do this well. That address your issue? Yeah, so hopefully there'll be another phase after this where we are expanding, but right now we're just kicking the tires and seeing what might be hard. Other thoughts? Yes.
I'm just picking up on some of the questions. I'm wondering if there's been much conversation about the risk of the gold standard being perfect. Because I think the way we practice right now has a lot of imperfection. And even ways that we've innovated recently have a lot of error. When you look across tens of thousands of practitioners, there's going to be tons of lack of knowledge, tons of lack of skill, tons of error in the system. So in moving to AI or even precision, if our standard is that it's always going to be right, is that standard way too high? I mean, I think I'd be a bit rhetorical with that, but then how do you set a reasonable standard? Because when we're talking about, as you said, very high stakes, it's hard to make the argument that, well, that standard's too.
So I want to try to clarify your question as I say it for the Zoom folks, because I hear maybe two different directions and we can go both. Are you saying the standard for the performance of the AI tools and the precision education systems? And then we can also think about the standards for the performance of the healthcare providers or the educators, et cetera. Yeah, so it is a very interesting conversation. as I've gone around and talked to places about AI, even separate from the standards of performance, the things that worry people about AI, their hands go up quickly. What about bias? AI is biased, or it will amplify bias. And all these issues just hold up a mirror to our status quo, right? What about the human connection and the relationship? All right. In our current system, we have a great deal of inequity and bias. And in the US, at least, if we say we value the patient-doctor relationship, but we have 10-minute visits, do we truly? And so sometimes in our head, we over-romanticize our own human performance. And so you're right, if we tried to make AI perfect, it can be short of perfect and probably offer improvement. And so that is an important thing to think through, of being honest and challenging our assumptions about our baseline. And then thinking about what is a reasonable tool. And to your point about what's a safe standard, I think it's been interesting to look at the AI scientists are thinking about it by the stakes of the task. Right. And so if it's a low stakes task, you can have a lower standard of performance, and it's probably still going to be beneficial. Taking a first pass at an email response for you might be a good idea of that. Whereas if it's a clinical decision support tool that you're really going to make a care decision based on, it has to have much higher expectations, right? The trick with that is that we have to be careful not to assume something doesn't have clinical implications. So for instance, some of the administrative things that have been applied, trying to use AI to determine insurance and access and eligibility for certain services, there have been some incidents in where that indeed has significant clinical implications, and the model was poorly developed with the wrong data points. So it wasn't that the model wasn't working, it was how the humans created the model and the data points that they chose to use. And so that's a reminder that AI in and of itself is not biased. We, as we design things, have preconceived notions, assumptions about what we're trying to measure, or we have flawed data that we're using. In terms of the performance of individuals, this is one of the things I'm very excited about when you started to say the gold standard of performance. From an educator's perspective, for particularly things like professionalism and communication skills, et cetera, we've had a very narrow vision of what good performance is. And we have, because of our desire for standardization to streamline and make things consistent, we have not embraced the rich differences of how people communicate effectively, or how they might think through a problem in different ways. I'm really intrigued whether all of this data and these systems will allow us to embrace that complexity rather than trying to squash it. And so we may learn about new competencies or new effective ways of being because of the way we're studying this that we wouldn't have been aware of before.
I'm going to thank Dr. Lomis.
Yeah.
If you had a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, she was going to be available at the conclusion of our lecture. I'm going to now invite our Vice Dean Education to come and present the Sibley Award winners.
Thanks, Jonathan. So my name is Rob White. I'm the Vice Dean Education in the Faculty of Health Sciences here at McMaster. I want to thank Jonathan and Merritt for putting on the Sibley lecture each year. I want to thank Dr. Lomis. It was very stimulating conversation. I think probably we could be asking you questions all night about this. The field is so new, and it has such, as we've heard from the questions, such significant implications, both in how we are going to be thinking about teaching soon, how will teach, and how we'll deliver clinical care. So thank you very much for that. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to all of you the recipients of this year's John C. Sibley Award for Excellence in Education for Part-Time Faculty in the Faculty of Health Sciences. So there's probably two really neat parts of my job each year. One is selecting our valedictorian, the student who represents the dreams and aspirations of our students as they convocate. And selecting our Sibley Award recipients is certainly another one
as I get to explore the contributions that part-time faculty are making in our Faculty of Health Sciences. So Dr. Lomis started with gratitude at the beginning for the work that all of us do. And I want to express really enormous gratitude to our part-time faculty who, at least at this institution, just make such a significant contribution. I'm going to talk to you about 3 part-time faculty. I'm going to start with our namesake for the lecture today, Dr. John Sibley. So you heard that he goes by Jack or went by Jack. He first appeared in McMaster around 1967, and he was assistant to our founding dean at the time, Dr. John Evans. Dr. Evans assigned Sibley the task of developing educational and clinical programs, first in chronic disease and rehabilitation. So Jack Sibley's first task was to work as the executive director of our rehab hospital here in the city. And together with Alan McNabb and Adrian Yaffe, Jack started the clinical investigation unit at the Hamilton General Hospital. Around the same time, he also started the Hamilton Institute of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. When Jack was becoming involved with McMaster, he also remained the head of the Department of Medicine at Joseph Brant Hospital in Burlington. His initial responsibilities to the medical school were significant. He also developed the concept of a core residency training program, and so our postgraduate medical education office here at McMaster, and all of that work was done as a part-time faculty member. Sibley was also closely involved in developing cooperative programs between Mohawk College and McMaster University for teaching physio and occupational therapists, and development of the nurse practitioner and clinical behavioral sciences programs here at McMaster. You cannot imagine a Jack of all trades or all professions, I think, more than Jack Sibley. He had a huge influence on educational program in the early days of the Faculty of Health Sciences of McMaster, and you can see he was really significant in contributing to our interprofessional foundations in the faculty. The John C. Sibley Award for Excellence in Education for part-time faculty recognizes part-time faculty members who have made contributions in 4 major dimensions, and these are the dimensions that the selection committee considered in the nominees: development and evaluation of innovative educational activities in health sciences, support of interprofessional education, sustained commitment to the academic mission, and impact on teaching and learning in Faculty of Health Sciences programs and initiatives. In my speech, it says occasionally the nominations we receive, but to be honest, every year we get a slew of tremendous nominees, and the fact that 1 or 2 rise to the top, I'm really happy to share those folks with you today. And this is one of those years where we are awarding 2 awards. I'm going to introduce you to each of our awardees this evening. I'll do each one separately, and then invite them to come up and say a few words if they wish to. So first, please join me in congratulating Dr. Karen Forward as one of our 2 recipients of this year's Sibley Award for Excellence in Education for part-time faculty. Dr. Forward is a pediatric emergency medicine physician, an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics, and the program director for pediatric emergency medicine fellowship at McMaster. As a clinician educator, she brings deep expertise in competency-based medical education, simulation-enhanced learning, and assessment scholarship, drawing on a strong foundation in educational theory to shape high-quality, learner-centered training environments. Dr. Ford was particularly noted for her innovative leadership in curriculum design and assessment, her sustained commitment to interprofessional education, and her impact on learners across multiple levels of training. As program director, she developed and implemented a comprehensive, entrustable professional activities-aligned, competency-based fellowship curriculum, integrating simulation, particularly for high acuity, low occurrence or HALO incident training. She also pioneered novel assessment platforms and procedural training innovations that have strengthened learner entrustability, enhanced the quality of workplace-based assessment data, and supported continuous program improvement. This must have rung true to you, this conversation today. Her work brings together physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, paramedics, and allied health professionals in shared learning, reinforcing collaboration, psychological safety, and excellence in team-based emergency care. Through her leadership, mentorship, and scholarly approach to education, Dr. Ford has made a lasting contribution to pediatric emergency medicine education at McMaster and beyond. Her impact on curriculum development, faculty and learner support, and educational infrastructure exemplifies the very best of part-time faculty engagement. Congratulations to Karen. Please join me again in congratulating our second recipient of this year's Sibley Award for Excellence in Education for part-time faculty, Dr. Jennifer Mitten. Dr. Mitten is an assistant clinical professor and longstanding part-time faculty member in the School of Nursing, as well as the nursing practice advisor with Hamilton Public Health Services. She brings deep expertise in community and public health nursing, professional practice leadership, and health systems policy, offering students a rich and grounded perspective that bridges academic learning with real-world application. This combination of academic and practice leadership has shaped all aspects of her teaching and curricular contributions. Dr. Mitten was particularly noted for her sustained leadership in community and population health education, a strong commitment to interprofessional learning, and expertise in translating complex public health challenges into meaningful educational experiences. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she played a pivotal role in creating experiential learning opportunities that embedded nursing students within community vaccination clinics, supporting public health response while offering transformative learning for students. More broadly, her leadership in curriculum redevelopment, spanning community nursing, civic engagement, and service learning, has strengthened program relevance, equity-focused practice, and student preparedness across the BSCN program. Colleagues and learners alike describe her as an engaged mentor, an innovative educator, and a trusted voice in nursing education and practice. Congratulations to Dr. Mitten, and please join me in congratulating her.
No, just to thank everyone.
Yeah.
So I started at McMaster in 1995. So I basically grew up here and never left. So just to thank the faculty and the administration for all the opportunities that I've had, starting back in 1995 with Basanti Majumdar, who I still have coffee with, who was my thesis advisor, and more recently, Joanna, who I picked up the phone one day when vaccines were rolling out, and I said, how do we integrate the nursing students into public health work? Because we were desperate for health human resources. So anyways, thank you very much.
I'm going to thank you all again for coming. I'm going to turn things back over to Jonathan.
Congratulations to our award winners. Thank you to our guest speaker. If you found some of the ideas here striking, these are the kind of conversations that we have as part of the Merit community. We'd welcome you to join us and be part of these conversations as they happen each month. The content of today's presentation is also available, well, will be available after we do some post-production in about a month's time. You can find it on our YouTube channel and share it with colleagues. Perhaps it sparks some conversations about where you want to think about where precision education is taking you. As always, thank you for your engagement. I invite you to kind of spend some time, maybe meeting with Dr. Lomis a bit more, congratulating our award winners, speaking to the selection committee and seeing what your chances are for next year. Thank you to those who joined us online, and everyone have a good evening.